The resource person is Professor Shivaji Chakravarti, Director, NIT Calicut. The webinar is organized by NIT Calicut in conjunction with IEEE Kerala Malabar subsection. Now, Professor Shivaji Chakravarti requires no introduction to academia. He's a director since 2015 and knows all the faculty and staff and many of the students by their first names. Before coming to, or he's still a professor at Jadavpur, with which he has had a very long innings. He proved his merit there by topping in his BTech and MTech. And apart from NIT Calicut and Jadavpur, his route map includes many research, teaching and industry positions. For example, in Siemens, Germany, Virginia Tech, USA, University of Hamburg, and so on. He has 106 publications in peer-reviewed journals, including 66 in IEEE Transactions, and he has many funded research projects from MHRD and NSF USA, DST, and so on. He's a very active professional. He has been the IEEE chair for India in 2018-19. And he is the fellow of many reputed professional bodies like Academy of Science, Academy of Engineering, IETE, and so on, and many others too. So he has a very deep interest. Apart from his research topics and subject area, he's interested in lifelong learning, and that is his motivation in today's talk. He wants to share his research insights and experience with the young researchers of today. And that is the motivation behind organizing this talk. During these difficult times, keeping social distancing in view, he has been with the campus through these difficult times. He has been promoting and encouraging innovation and research for the sake of pandemic control and prevention. And it is because of his understanding of the difficulties faced by the research scholars in these times that he has offered and volunteered to address them and share his wisdom with all of us. So over to Professor Chakravarti now. But before that, let me just remind you that the chat session can be used in order to post your questions, and they'll be taken at the end. Thank you. Over to sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thanks for the introduction. I hope I am audible. Okay.
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Okay, thanks, ma'am.
Yes. Thank you, sir. Please start.
Yeah, yes, I'm sharing my screen. Okay, you can see my screen. Now my screen is visible. Okay, so very warm good morning to all the participants of this webinar organized by IEEE Malabar section and NIT Calicut. The title that I have chosen for this webinar is, as you can see on the screen, that experimentation, how to do it in a structured manner. Now, at the very outset, to set the tone for this presentation, I will put forward a couple of arguments which I have heard at different corners of the country. You may or may not agree to it, but the fact remains that people talk about this. There are many, but I will put forward 3 of them. The first argument is like this, that very often people lack practical experience, and hence are not able to properly relate theory to practice or provide design experiences. Another argument that I have heard is that in our present day system, research activities are rewarded to a great extent. Teaching experience is also rewarded, but to a lesser extent. But practical experience is rewarded very insignificantly. The third argument is highly debatable, but still I will put forward that experimentation is an avenue for those people who are not creative researchers. Now, why people talk about all this? Is it because of the fact that people are biased? Or is it because of the fact that in most of the cases, when we do our experimentation, we do it in a manner which is not structured. And as a result, most of the cases, in many cases, we do not get the desired results. So with this backdrop, I am starting this webinar. Now, at the outset, I make it very clear that in this webinar, I am not going to present any new concept. On the contrary, I will be presenting very down-to-earth thing. That means how to implement experimentation in a structured manner. And I will be talking mostly from my experience, being associated with the high voltage laboratory of Jadavpur University, Kolkata for 35 years. So I start this discussion with some questions to be considered when you do structured experimentation. Question number 1, which is a very fundamental question. Often we don't give enough importance to it. But this is very important. That is, what is the problem? Now let us divide it into 3 sub-questions. First part is, what is being studied? We can look at it in many different ways. Let me take an example. Let's say we are in the civil engineering laboratory and we are performing experiments on determination of the compressive strength of concrete. Now, this can be done in many different ways. For example, I am studying one particular property of one particular material, or I am comparing a particular property of different materials. So there are many ways it can be studied. So the person who is doing the experimentation should be very clear that what is being studied. And naturally, why is it studied is the next question. Is it simply from an academic point of view, or simply to know certain values of the properties under study? Or there is a third question, that how is it relevant? For example, this concrete example, quite obviously this is very relevant to our practical sites, because the concrete will be used for structures, and that structure will have to withstand loads. This could be static load, this could be dynamic load. And for that matter, today itself, you know that in the eastern coast of India, there will be a super cyclone. So structures has to withstand those loads. So these properties that we are studying in the laboratory will be very useful in determining the ability of those structures on site, and also the sustainability of those structures. And when it becomes very clear that whatever we are doing in the laboratory is very relevant in our day-to-day practical life, the whole experimentation becomes very attractive to the science and engineering students. Then what is the next question? Next question is, which physical laws are involved? Many a times we perform the experimentation in a routine manner without going into the details of those experimentation. Every experimentation that we do have certain physical laws involved. Again, these physical laws could be specific to one area. Again, let me take an example. Say I am doing the experimentation on Ohm's law. Very simple experimentation. So the physical law will be related to only one area. But let's say the current is high and then heat is generated. And it could be such that in that experimentation, the heat flow laws are also involved. Or if the electric field is high, then electromagnetic radiation could also be involved. So in those cases, the physical laws which are involved become multidisciplinary. So we have to understand which physical laws are involved. And if it is very clear, then we will see in subsequent discussion that many things becomes much more clearer. Now coming to a very practical side of the experimentation. How accurately do we need to know the answer? Many a times we take it for granted, or we just take that, oh, this is the accuracy. But to make an experimentation in a structured manner, we must clearly know this. For example, what is my target error band? If it is say plus minus 5%, then the whole experimental setup could be very common. We can use very normal equipment, instruments, etc. On the other hand, if we say that my target error band is less than 1%, then that normal or commonplace experimental setup may not be enough. We may have to use sophisticated instrumentation and also proper equipments to get that error band. Here, I would like to highlight another aspect which in many cases we overlook. That is called the tolerance. In science and engineering, and for that matter in our regular life, tolerance is extremely important. In this experiment, if we have to buy something, then we have to specify the technical details for procurement. If we don't say the tolerance, will it be possible to procure? Let me give a very simple example. If I want to walk from one wall of this room to the opposite wall, and if somebody says that my steps should be exactly 100 centimeters, it should not be 99 centimeters, it should not be 101 centimeters. Will it be possible for me to walk? In all probability, no. Another example, day-to-day life. I go back to my home, ask my wife to give me food. And I tell her, I will take 100 grams of rice. I will not take 99 grams of rice. I will not take 101 grams of rice. I will take 100 grams. Can she give me? The answer is simply no. So we have to understand that our real life, practical life is not exact. So we have to always talk about the tolerance. I give another example. Say I need a sphere for my laboratory, metallic sphere. of diameter 25 centimeter. For procurement, if I say that the diameter could be 25 centimeter plus minus 5 millimeter, then many people will be able to make it. The cost will be not so high, and I will get my sphere quickly. On the other hand, if I say that I need this sphere of diameter 25 centimeter plus minus less than 1 millimeter, then the machining requirement will be extremely accurate. Not many people will be make it, and cost will be high, and also delivery time will be high. So the whole experimental process, the time required will be considerably higher. So please always give enough importance to tolerance in science and engineering. Coming to the fourth question, what set of experiments might provide the answer? This very much depends on the physical laws involved, because depending on that, you have to make the experimental setup. And then the type of equipment instrument that we will use will depend on the error band as well as the tolerance. You can see a very simple setup. This is an Ohm's law based experiment. And here, if I say that my error band is plus minus 5%, I can use very simple equipment, as you can see. But if I say my error band is 0.5%, then such simple instruments will not be possible to use. Then we'll require much sophisticated instrument. The whole setup will become expensive. And also to get those sophisticated equipment will require longer time. So before going into the experimentation, we must have the answer to these questions. Then coming to the operative part, that in any experimentation, there will be many variables. So we must know which variables must be controlled and how well. As we know that in any experimentation, there will be some independent variable and dependent variable. Again, let me take the example of Ohm's law. I say that my independent variable is voltage and my dependent variable is current. Is that enough? Probably no. There is a third type of variable which influences the experimentation significantly. For example, in this Ohm's law experiment, let's take the variable temperature. If temperature is constant, we'll get a certain result. If temperature varies, definitely my result will vary. Therefore, temperature becomes a control variable. And therefore, for doing this experimentation, depending on the physical laws that are involved, we should have a clear idea that what is the relationship that is expected between the dependent and the independent variables, and what type of influence the control variables have on the relationship. If that is clear, then we get a very clear idea about exactly how we are going to perform the experimentation. Now, when we have set up our experimental arrangement and we have decided which variables to control, etc., the next question is which quantities are to be measured and how accurately. As I have said, in this Ohm's law simple experiment, we are going to measure voltage and current, and probably we will also measure temperature. But the question comes that what will be the range of measurement? Say I am measuring current. Will it be kiloampere? Will it be ampere? Or will it be milliampere? the techniques for measuring kiloampere and for measuring milliampere are not same. So therefore, depending on the range that we are expecting, the experimental setup will also change. And depending on the required accuracy, as we have already discussed, the entire instrumentation could change. So therefore, the next question comes that what instrumentation need to be used? Now here, we have to look into the measurement a little bit in depth. In our practical life, the measurements that we do could be direct measurement or it could be indirect measurement. Direct measurement means the quantity that we are going to measure is directly fed to the instrument. Again, taking a very common example that we are measuring, say, current by ammeter, then the current is fed directly to the ammeter. Or we are measuring voltage by voltmeter, we are applying or feeding the voltage directly to the voltmeter. These are all examples of direct measurement. But there are a lot of indirect measurements in our experimental techniques today. A simple example is I am going to measure very low current. In current to the ammeter, what we can do is this low current can be passed through a known resistance. Then we can measure the voltage drop across this known resistance. And this voltage drop divided by the known resistance will give me the current. So this is an indirect measurement. Or take the example of high voltage measurement. If the voltage is of the order of kilovolts, we cannot feed it directly to the voltmeter. In such cases, what we do, we incorporate certain intermediary equipment, for example, potential transformers or potential dividers. Those intermediary equipments, what they do is they bring down the high voltage to a lower value, and then we measure the low voltage with the help of a common voltmeter. If the ratio of transformation is known, then from the measured low voltage, we can always compute the high voltage that we are targeting to measure. So this is an indirect measurement. Similarly, let's say we are trying to measure very high temperature. What we can do is a resistance subjected to that high temperature, of course made of proper material. Let's say we are trying to measure the temperature of a furnace of the order of 800 degrees centigrade. So by putting a resistance of proper material, what we can measure is the change in resistance due to temperature. And from that we can find out what will be the temperature. So again, it's an indirect measurement. So in this way, we can think of a lot of indirect measurements which are so important today in our experimental techniques. And we need to know these measurement techniques properly, because if the measurement is wrong, the recorded data is wrong, and the inferences drawn from those measured data will be also wrong. So we have to be extremely careful when we perform such measurements. Then the next question is, now when we are doing the experiment, we have to acquire the data and then we have to store it And in between, we have to probably process it also. We call it pre-processing. And here I would like to put forward certain aspects. In today's world, naturally, we will do digital data acquisition. So what type of analog to digital converter to be used is a major concern or a question to be answered. For example, if the accuracy required is less, I can use an 8-bit converter, whereas if the accuracy required is much higher, then we can go for a higher bit converter. But then that decision has to be taken beforehand, before we perform the experimentation. And we have to make the arrangement, experimental arrangement properly so that the data is properly acquired. Many a times in our experimentation, the data range that we have to cover is too big. Well, we can do it probably, but the time required will be very high, the effort to be given will be very high. So sometimes a question comes that can we limit our range of variables within which we will acquire the data? But then how do we decide it? For that, simulation becomes very helpful. So before performing the experimentation, we can perform simulation, and getting the results of simulation, we can find out that which range of the variable is significant for us, significant for our experimentation. And in real experimental setup, then we will not perform the experiment over that entire range. We will do it within that range found from simulation. So what simulation has done in this case is they have helped us in determining the appropriate range, and in the process have helped us in reducing the time of the total experimentation as well as the effort. And that is a very big contribution. Many a times in academic world, there is a debate that we are depending too much on simulation, we are doing too much simulation, we are not doing proper experimentation. My view is simulation and experimentation are not opposite to each other. In fact, they go hand in hand. And if we can blend them properly, the experimentation becomes successful within a shorter time. And that is very important for performing any project, whether it is a UG project or a PhD project, within a time limit. Now we have, say, performed the experimentation and we have acquired the data. So what we get at first is the raw data. Again, here I would like to highlight that in digital data acquisition, the data that we acquire is called a time series. What is a time series? That means if you put this data into a table, there will be two columns. One column will be the time samples and the second column will be the data recorded. This data recorded could be anything. It could be voltage, it could be temperature, it could be velocity, anything. And the time sample is the step size of time in which the data is recorded. Since this is digital data, it is not analog data, so we do not have a continuous variation. We go from one step to the other. So this step size of time again is very much dependent on the AD converter. and the bit size of the AD converter. So as we can find that all this data acquisition and the experimental hardware contribute significantly in the experimental analysis also. Now let's say we have the raw data. First point is, if I am doing this experiment in our laboratory, probably noise will be less. If we do it on site, in real life, then there will be a lot of noises involved. So, should we do any sort of denoising before we store the data? That decision will have to be taken by those who are doing the experimentation. Another very important aspect is when we are recording multiple variables, then their units as measured could be widely varying in range. For example, in Ohm's law experiment, if the applied voltage is in volts and if the known resistance is in kilo ohms, then the current will be in milliampere. So we can see that if we take all the data together, then the range becomes milli to kilo, which means a range of 10 to the power 6. That's very high range. And if we do the data analysis considering this entire range, there is every possibility that we will be facing very big problems in analysis. So what we need to do is we have to bring all the variables within a fixed range. Typically, this range is fixed as -1 to +1 or 0 to 1. And this process is called normalization. So we have to decide, that means those who are doing the experimentation, that whether normalization is required. Many times when we perform the experiment, the data that we record, if we study carefully, we will find that large number of data, the magnitude is insignificant. But there are data, not of very high numbers, quantities, which have significant magnitude. So therefore, we have two sets of data, a large set of data having insignificant magnitude or amplitude, and a smaller set of data of significant amplitude. In such cases, we say that the data have sparsity. In today, we have several sparsity techniques, and we can apply those sparsity techniques to this data set before storing data. And these will help in our subsequent data analysis to a great extent. So, when we perform the experimentation, it is not that we just decide on the hardware to be set up, but we have to decide several things well in advance. So therefore, I am putting forward all these questions, that let us keep all these questions in mind when we perform the experiment in a structured manner. Now we are taking the data. A question will come that how many data points are to be taken and in what order. Let me explain again. Again, I am taking that example of Ohm's law experiment. I am measuring voltage, say from 0 to 1000 volt. So what we can do is, we can take say 20 measurement points or 100 measurement points distributed uniformly over the entire range, that is 0 to 1000 volt. But it could be also such that we are more interested in certain range and less interested in certain range. So what we can do is, say between 0 to 500 volt, we will take 10 points, measurement points, and between 500 volt to 1000 volt, we will take 50 measurement points. But that has to be decided beforehand so that the time and effort needed for experimentation is optimized. Now here I have said that whatever be the range, the data is distributed uniformly. But is it necessary that it has to be distributed uniformly? The answer is no. Many a times we distribute our data points logarithmically. Again, I give an example. From my own experience, we have performed experiments in our lab where we have varied frequency over very wide range and measured certain quantities, certain material properties. We have varied frequency from 1 millihertz to 1 kilohertz. Now, if you look at this range, it is of the order of 10 to the power 6. If we want to distribute our measurement points uniformly over the range of 10 to the power 6, it will require enormous amount of time and effort on run of the experiment. Forget about multiple runs. So in those cases, we don't distribute the measurement points uniformly. Rather, we distribute the points, measurement points logarithmically, taking each decade So now, when we do, or we have done all of this, a very important question comes that whatever requirements that we have decided, fine, they are technically fine, they are fundamentally fine, theoretically fine, but satisfy the requirements, first of all, within the budget, second, within the given time constraints. I give enormous importance to both these questions, particularly for science and engineering students and scholars. From my experience in working in labs, in working in industries, I have learned that if I design my requirement in such a way that it crosses the budget, then I cannot implement it. Well, if I have very big budget, then no problem. But I can guarantee that in 99% of cases, all of us will have limited budget. So we have to fix our requirement so that it can be satisfied within the budget. And very importantly, we should fix our requirement so that the project can be finished within the time constraints. months to do all those procurements to be completed. And if the project is of 1 year duration, then how can we perform it within the time? Therefore, looking into the time constraints, we have to fix our requirement also. And in this aspect, I give more stress on engineering because engineers in their entire professional life has to execute projects within the budget and the time constraints. And if we learn it from the institute itself while doing our UG, PG or PhD programs, then I can tell you that we will satisfy a term that is being used today, that we are industry ready. People talk a lot about today about the graduates and the graduands of the institute to be industry ready. So this is a way to become industry ready. Now, when all of this has been done, of course, data has to be analyzed. So which method of data analysis need to be used? There are n number of data analysis methods today, so I should not go into all of that. I just throw some light on a few important aspects. As I have said that in today's digital domain, whatever we record is called a time series. And we say that data has been recorded in time domain. And whatever quantity you have measured with respect to time, in all probability, they will not remain constant, but they will vary with time. In other words, there will be a frequency of variation of that particular quantity which has been measured. The issue is, if the frequency remains constant over time, and if we want to know the hidden features, the hidden properties of this data set, can we find it by analyzing the time series? Well, sometimes yes, we can do by using some analysis methods in the time domain. But many a times it has been found that if we do a domain transformation, we could use several other techniques to find out these hidden or inner features of the data set. So we convert the data from time domain to frequency domain. And for that, Fourier transform can be used if frequency of variation of the quantity remains constant over time. But it may not be the case always. The frequency can vary. In most cases, we use Veblet transform instead of the Fourier transform. After that, we have to use certain, after the domain transform, I mean, often we use feature extraction techniques to extract the features of that data set. And when we get these features, in most of the cases, we need a classification, and therefore we can use several classification techniques that is currently available. So feature extraction along with classification is a very powerful tool today. Another aspect I want to highlight is that today, when we do the experimentation, there are often large number of data, and we talk about big data today. And when we have such large number of data, there will be always data which are redundant in nature. Then why should we use it, those data, redundant data, for analysis? Nowadays, we have techniques to eliminate such redundant data, and it will be always useful for the overall analysis. We should never underestimate the statistical analysis. There are so many tools available in the statistical analysis which can throw very significant light on the experimental data that we have acquired. There is one analysis we hardly go into, but is often, particularly for experimental work, very important. First thing is, and this analysis is called uncertainty analysis. Let me take it a little bit more details. Many times when we perform the experiment, we take a data for a given value of variables. And then immediately we become happy if the data is okay. We prepare the table, we prepare the graph, and we write the paper. But I always ask a question to myself that if I do this again, do I get that exact result next time? In all probability, we will not get. So, in a good practical data recording, we must take multiple readings for the same values of variables using the experimental setup. And then we'll see that instead of getting a single point on the graph, probably for a given value of dependent variable, we'll get a band of values for the dependent variable. So when on the graph for a given value of independent variable, we'll get a vertical bar with a maximum and minimum for the dependent variable. So many times in our experimentation, we don't do it. This is first point. Second point, we all talk about error analysis. We say that the error in our experiment is 1%. Now a fundamental question is raised here that whenever we say error is 1%, which means that there is one result which we take it as the correct or true value. And this error in our experiment is 1% with respect to the true value. What comes to mind is that how do we know that the other value is the true value? And in particular, if that other value is also measured by another equipment, how can we say that that other equipment is correct? That is that perfectly true value? The answer is we cannot say that. So here there is an uncertainty. So it is not error. Error is different, uncertainty is different. So here the uncertainty is in the true value. So then we do certain uncertainty with a certain confidence limit. That means, are we confident that our data is, say, within this band of the true value? And if I am confident, how much confident? 95% confidence limit. That means with 95% confidence, we can say that our data recorded is within this band of the true value. So here we are not talking about the error, we are talking about the uncertainty in our results. And when we do this sort of analysis and present in the publications, I have found it to be enormously helpful in getting our papers published in top-notch international journals. And when we do all these analysis, is there any unanticipated question raised by the data? It need not be necessarily bad. And the fact is that many a time such unanticipated question is being raised by the data recorded. Yes, it could be bad. That means it could be due to something wrong in experimentation. But it could also be a new finding. And finally, whatever project we are doing, as I said, it could be UG, PG, PhD, and later on in professional life. We should always present our data in a very effective and revealing way. And in this, I am not talking about making a flashy presentation using PowerPoint or any other software. What I am talking about, an effective and revealing way. I am going to put forward suggestions which I have found to be very useful in my life. So I am telling you my experience. That we need self-explanatory, neatly drawn, simple diagrams in which the components must be labeled unambiguously. I have seen my scholars preparing the diagrams in a software and then copy pasting it in the word processor. Now, when the diagram is prepared in the software, it looks fine. But when it is copy pasted in the word processor, it becomes jumbled up. And many times I have seen that they are unreadable. That's not a good way of preparing a report. So we have to be careful in that. Then in the report, particularly in the experimental report, we must describe measurement technique, the instruments used. If there is any fabrication involved, then fabrication technique, tolerance, error, etc. Now, this is of great importance. Why? Because in any laboratory, when a project is being undertaken, let's say it is for 1 year or 2 years or so, that's not the end of it. One student or a group of students may be undertaking that project. And when they finish, probably next year or so, the faculty involved can think of extending that project involving another group of students. Now, if the first group of students don't describe all those techniques that they have used, then it will be very difficult for the second group of students to understand what was done. And then if they want to extend that work, they have to probably start from zero. Now that is wastage of time and effort. It should not be done. So we should describe all these techniques properly. Then comes what I sometimes say, dressing of the paper, dressing of the project report. Now, we have to present our data. That can be done in a tabular form, that can be done in a graphical form. Yes, my suggestion is we should use tables, but not too many. Presentation of data more in the graphical form is attractive. But there has to be a proper mix of table and graphical form. This is called the proper dressing of the report or the paper. And when we take a graph, many times I have seen that the curves are not clearly labeled. The labeling is ambiguous and it is not clean. On many examples, I have seen that there are 3 or 4 graphs on a plot, but it is not clear which one is which one. Or the scaling is such that the significant aspect of the plots are not clear. Here I would like to mention another thing, that the quantities in the x-axis and the y-axis should be always clearly mentioned. And not only that, the unit should be clearly mentioned, because without unit, it bears no meaning. And when we prepare a table or a graph, we should give a proper caption to each one, so that when somebody is reading, they will get a clear idea by reading the caption. They don't have to read the text of the report to know what is there in the figure. So these were the various questions that have to be considered. Now let us come into the implementation based on these questions. So I have tried to make it in different phases. The phase 1 is primarily involving the first 4 questions. It's called the planning phase. So we consider and evaluate the various approaches and find out that which one might lead to an answer to the questions being asked. And if this planning phase is done properly, I can assure you that the whole implementation becomes much more easier. And after that, we go into the design phase involving question number 5, 6, and 7. There may be some overlap in these questions. That is understandable. Now, in the planning phase, whatever information we have gathered, then we'll prepare a list of instrumentation that is needed. We'll write down the details of the configuration, that is experimental configuration, with all the apparatus, etc. And here I would suggest, again, from the engineering point of view, make it a practice that for given experiment, prepare a bill of materials. This is so important in professional life. So if we start doing it from the laboratory itself, then you will see that later on in your life, you will be so ready for industry. So prepare a bill of materials. And how do you do it? Make a table of all the apparatus, instrument, equipment, but don't just write the name. Write the ratings. For example, if I am using some power measurement, is it in watts or milliwatts or kilowatt? So we write the ratings. Similarly, we write the range. So all these things very clearly should be written in the bill of materials. And if it is done properly, then if we have to procure something, it becomes very easy. Then we design the test plan. Similarly, we take the decisions of what are the ranges of conditions that we have to run in the experiment, what are the data to be taken, in which order you have to take the data, which involves this question number 5, 6, 7 that we have discussed earlier. I advise to my scholars always, whether it is UG, PG or PhD, doesn't matter, that please prepare a properly time-stamped milestone map. And what is it? That means that from the beginning of the project, we'll have to say that our planning phase will go from, say, January to February. Design phase will start in February, it will go to April. Then from April to June, July, we will do the experiment. Like that, all the time-stamped milestone map has to be prepared at the very beginning. And it helps us in implementing, and it helps us to show that whether we are adhering to the time stampings. That means whether we are doing it in the time or we are overstepping the time limits. This is again very important, and if we do it, again we become industry ready. After that, there is something called a construction phase. That means when we have the components, we assemble it, we make the whole overall experimental setup. But then a very important question is to be asked, that we are using certain instruments in our experimental setup, and they will give you some result. How confident you are that these results are accurate? For that, actually, we need to calibrate our instruments. Very often in most of the laboratories, we don't give enough importance to calibration. We think that we have bought a very good equipment in 2015 and we are doing the experiment in 2020, and we feel that, well, this instrument is bought from a very big company, so the results are correct. It's not necessary. And in most of the cases, probably it's not true. So we have to do proper calibration of the instruments involved so that any error analysis is on a solid footing. And always consider the availability of space. From my own experience, I know a case that a very sophisticated equipment was bought and it was delivered to the laboratory and it was installed. But unfortunately, that building was next to a very major road. So whenever heavy vehicles used to go, there were a lot of vibrations and this equipment always malfunctions. That means it was not properly considered in the design phase or the planning phase. And what happened is that the entire thing had to be shifted, new space had to be found, and the whole time of the project, timeline of the project got delayed by almost 6 to 8 months. Now that is actually bad planning. Into what is called the debugging phase. That means we do some initial trial runs using all the apparatus and the test setup and see whether there is any unexpected problem. And here I must say that in experimentation, we should always expect the unexpected problems. And in most of the cases when they are there, these problems are there, these have to be addressed. In some cases, this leads to some redesign. In some cases, the operational procedure has to be changed. Then we go into the execution phase. That means now we perform the real experiments. We take the data, we store it. And then, of course, we go into the data analysis phase. And we use appropriate data analysis techniques to get the required answers to the questions. Here I have to highlight 2 points, very important, which we don't consider very often. As I said, that our data can always throw some new finding. Now, if it is a new finding, we have to authenticate it. how do you authenticate a new finding? There are two aspects to it. One is called repeatability, the other is called reproducibility. The repeatability means that we perform the experiment in the same lab with the same setup, but at different times. And the result should be repeatable. Then what is reproducibility? Reproducibility means that the same experiment needs to be performed in another lab using another setup of that particular lab, and we should get similar results. If our data that we have got are repeatable and reproducible, then any new finding is authenticated. And we can publish those in top-notch international journals. And finally, of course, is the reporting phase. As I have stressed earlier, that our data and findings must be represented so that we can maximize the usefulness of all the experimentation that I have or our team has done. So I go back to the final initial arguments with which I have started. So if an experimental program is performed in a structured manner, then we can give answers to those arguments. Then we can say that one is able to relate theory with practice. Then we can say that one can do creative experimentation and one will get proper value of the practical experience gained. And this one, when represented in a different way, we can say that our students and scholars become industry ready. So with this, I thank you all for giving a patient hearing. And now over to ma'am.
Thank you very much, sir. It was a very interesting and illuminating talk. I ask the audience once more to post their questions, please. Audience, please, in case you have any questions, let's have it. So thank you, sir. The
Yes,
audience
please.
can post questions anytime. Meanwhile,
Yes.
I'll hand over to. There is one question.
Yeah, I can see that. Please tell again feature extraction. Is that the question?
Okay. Please tell again feature extraction from Professor Simon Peter to you.
Yeah. See, what I tried to mean is that, say, I have recorded a time series data, and then I want to seize or I want to study the pattern. It's not so always easy that just plotting the time series, we will be able to judge the pattern or the nature of variation or whether they belong to certain group, certain classes. So what we have to do is that we have to extract certain features. Now these features are of different types. They depend on the data set, whatever experiment you are doing. Now, what we mostly do is we can use certain techniques in time domain. For example, let's say correlation techniques, by which we can get certain features of the data. Or very often we transform the domain from time domain to frequency domain by using some mathematical technique. And then we can use certain feature extraction techniques. Now this could be, for example, discrete wavelet transform. If we use discrete wavelet transform, there are a lot of useful features that we can get as the output of the transform. There are many other techniques. I have not prepared a slide on that, but there are so many such techniques which can be used to extract the what we call the inherent features, which will not be clear to naked eye. Once we do it, then you will be able to probably classify the features, and then you can see that whether they belong to certain classes or that may be a completely new class. And that gives a very significant insight into the data. That's what I can tell with respect to this question. Next question. If any.
We have another question from Olive. It is how to choose experimental measurement devices.
Well, first thing is, as I have already said, that first we have to understand that what are the physical laws involved. And then, depending on the physical laws, we have to decide what are my independent variables, what are my dependent variables, and what are my control variables. Once we have identified the variables, then depending on the variables, we should know that these are the devices. Because if you want to measure velocity, you will use one device. If you want to measure pressure, you will use another device, like so on and so forth. So once we have decided that, then we have to choose, or we have to decide what will be the required accuracy. Then we will have certain choices. But then, as I have said, that I have my budget constraint, I have my time constraint. So whether that is being satisfied by my requirement, if not, please change the requirement a little bit. So in this way, we decide the experimental or the measurement devices.
Good questions.
So now another question I can see.
Yes.
This is regarding frequency is obtained from the time series data. How to find uncertainty in the time series and frequency. Actually, here I must say that this frequency is obtained from the time series data. So that is a secondary observation. The primary observation is in the time series. So this uncertainty analysis, if you go into that, I have another presentation which is on details, but the fact is that uncertainty analysis always has multiple components. And when we do the complete uncertainty analysis, we do the what is called the combined uncertainty analysis. So first thing is the recording uncertainty. Then there are a lot of involved uncertainties, and in fact that will be dependent on the hardware also. So if you go into any good material on the how to do uncertainty analysis, you will see that there are ways and means very clearly given. So I request you that there are some very good material in ISO and other documents which gives this information very well. Then I find another one that, can you please share more on planning phase? Well, planning phase, as I have said earlier or tried to highlight earlier, is that the first question is, This is from Mr. Vivek MR. Now, and he has put another one, that is how to timeline our planning phase. Well, important thing is that if your project is 1 year or 2 year or 3 year, depending on which level you are, I would suggest that planning phase should never go more than 10 to 15% of the time. That should be enough for doing the planning phase. That means if it is a 1 year project, you can use about 1.5 to maximum 2 months, not more than that, because otherwise you will not be able to implement. And in the planning phase, as I have said, mostly you decide on that what is being studied. Please get a clear idea of that. And for that, then we have to plan that what will be our variables, what will be required in an error band, what will be the tolerance, and depending on that, you plan what will be the experimental setup and the instruments. So this is what you have to do, and I would suggest use 10 to 15% of your project time to make the planning. But as I said, that there is a second stage called debugging phase. So probably in the debugging phase, you will find that there is something wrong, but that will then require some redesign, or maybe you can also change your operational procedure a bit. So that will help. Then I see Mr. Sujit Kumar. This is the fundamental problem with this question, right? Actually, this is a thing actually we don't understand, right? What is the difference between uncertainty and error? A very, very fundamental question, Mr. Sujit Kumar, you have raised. Of course, if it would have been better if I had certain slides, but let me tell you something like this. So when you say error, again I have said, how have you determined error? In any error analysis, we have one called test result, another one we call standard result. This is typically we call it in measurement. Well, test result means that is what we have obtained. That is the test result. Then there will be something called a standard result. We will compare our result with the standard result to get the error. Now the question comes that the standard result, say my standard result is 10, my result is 9.9, so I can know the error. But this standard result 10, are you sure that it is the true value? The answer is no, you are not sure. That standard value may not be also the true value. They can also have some error. There is a very clear-cut process of determining what we call traceability of results. For example, if you say kilogram, no measurement, whatever you do in India, is true value. The proper kilogram is kept somewhere, you can get it from the science books, that a proper kilogram is kept at a very particular temperature, etc., at certain place. That is 1 kilogram. All other results of kilogram are always with respect to that particular quantity. Now, can you and me go to that particular place and determine the error? No. So every country has an institution who has the responsibility to have the national standard. So first we have the international standard, that is the true value we take. Then we have the national standard. In India, this is the National Physical Laboratory. So they are given the responsibility that they should have some standard value whose error is determined with respect to the international standard. Then is it possible for me at NIT Calicut to go every time to National Physical Laboratory to find out our error? Answer is no. Then there are secondary standards. So we can have certain laboratories in different area and zones of the country. They will have their instrument calibrated in terms of the national standard. So this is called the traceability study. That means there is an international standard, which is the true value. With respect to that, a national standard is calibrated. So that error is fixed. Then national standard comes to the secondary standard, that is our zonal one. Say I have a lab in Kochi who has calibrated their equipment with respect to the national standard. So that is, they have a clear-cut traceability. Then I can take my instrument and go to the Kochi lab and get it calibrated. So I know what is my error. But then you can see that these entire errors are traceable to the international standard. This is called a traceability study. And if we do it properly, then that particular reading is a real authenticated reading. But this needs a lot of effort and thinking on the part of experimentation. But as you have rightly said, that if we do it, it is very useful for both the scholars as well as the lab and the faculties, everybody. I hope I could explain to the question raised by Mr. Sujit Kumar.
The next question from Mr. Venu Anand. While publishing experimental results, is it suggestive to represent graphs and data using
Venu, I have
the
missed earlier,
application
right.
software?
Is it suggestive to represent graphs and data using the instruments application software or use some common data analysis software? Thank you. Well, Dr. Venu, my view is any software you can use, but always we have to mention it properly, that which software I have used. And in some way, if we can have a proper framework. For example, I am telling you that I tried to explain that I am taking some results, experimental results. I'm talking here about experimental results. And I am using the instruments application software. Please find out that what type of pre-processing that software has done. Because that application software of the instrument is properly not giving you the raw data. So they might have done some pre-processing. And if you know the pre-processing, then you also can do some subsequent analysis based on that. Many a times we just simply take the data from the application software straight away, which is not a very proper way. Or I would suggest, if you are confident of analysis, take the raw data with all the noise and everything, and then you do your data analysis. You do whatever pre-processing is necessary. And then finally, you also do the analysis part. In that case, when you report your results, you can clearly state that this is the raw data, then this is the pre-processing, this is the analysis. I hope that will be very useful if you can do, but unfortunately, many instrument doesn't give raw data or doesn't allow raw data to be taken. So we have to take the data which is being pre-processed by the instrument itself. But then we should know what is that pre-processing that is being done. And that if you do properly and report properly, it is authenticated. Next question.
It seems there are no more questions to be answered. If there are more, please text in.
Which one? Anything I have missed here?
At
Can you tell me
this
the
point,
name?
I think we can pass over to Dr. Hari Krishnan from the Department of Civil Engineering, who was one of the organizers for this webinar. Hari Krishnan.
Good morning, everyone. I deem it as a great honor to propose a vote of thanks. We were indeed quite grateful to Dr. Shivaji Chakravarti, Professor and Director at NIT Calicut, for having taken his time off to deliver this webinar. Being an avid researcher and academician, his experience and expertise in the field of experimentation would indeed be a useful contribution for budding researchers. I also would like to thank the IEEE Kerala section, especially the Malabar subsection, for taking the initiative to organize this webinar. Thanks are also due to the Office of the Dean Academic and Professor Madhukumar and Professor Priya Chandran for helping out with this webinar. I would also like to thank the Campus Networking Center for providing the technical and support, the infrastructure arrangements for hosting this webinar. I hope many more webinars would be in the offing in cutting edge areas of science and technology. Last but not the least, I thank all the participants for your patient hearing, and I hope you had a very fruitful and take back from this webinar. Thank you very much. This particular webinar would be uploaded in the YouTube for viewing in the NITC official website. I thank you all once again, and I hope we would get to see you soon in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, everybody, and best wishes from NIT Calicut.
Thank you all. Thank you, sir, and thank you all for joining. Stay safe. Have a good day. Thank you.